move on now to the consumer perspective, or as we like to call it in Crosser, the people-centered perspective, eventually. We invited Guillaume Joly from the European Consumer Organization's energy team to talk about how they think we should make next generation EPCs meaningful for consumers. Guillaume is the Sustainable Building Officer of the Consumer Organization. He's a trained urbanist and a public policy designer, worked formerly for several local authorities in France, including Région Île-de-France, I hope I pronounce it well, and Métropole de Lille, as well as for C40, the worldwide network of global cities engaged in energy transition. And his core expertise is in energy transition, of course, but on private residential energy retrofits. And he's actually working on the Fit for 55 package revision of the energy directives. Without further ado, I would give the word to Guillaume.
Thanks, Eva, and hello, everyone. Just to build on the quick presentation you made of my background, I found it interesting to join a consumer organization to think about the benefits, the end beneficiaries of the different policies and programs or tools. So that's the perspective I'm going to present here on the energy performance certificates. What comes from our members, so the Consumer Defense Organization, the National Consumer Defense Organization, because consumers reach out to them to explain the difficulties they have with EPCs. So we have quite a bunch of recommendations to make on how to design them. Next slide, please. And I will start with the information we would like to see the EPCs display, starting with a range of costs for the recommended retrofit works. We think it's important to have it for consumers. So stating Julien, the 89% of people in the private sector, private housing, be them homeowners or tenants, by the way, and landlords in that case, we think it's important to have a range of costs for the works so that people can plan properly, so that they have this information not only for their own budget, but also for the discussion they can have with the banks, with the mortgage lenders, and also have a sense of what the grants would cover. So here, to have a range of costs, we think it's important to have an accurate approach. So we need to have updated and consensual figures, so that needs to be relying on local database. Second point I wanted to make is that households need the consumptions to be expressed in final energy. It's too complicated to have all households to get into the details of like final energy, another kind of energy I don't really understand because there is a lot of factor. What it's useful for consumers to understand the trade-off between the heating system and the insulation, and to understand they should shoot for insulation first, is the final energy. So we are definitely advocating for it to be the unit in which consumptions are expressed. Then the expected remaining lifespan of a heating and cooling systems. It makes it clearer for people that their appliance might break in the coming years. So it makes it easier for them to tick into retrofit works and to just discard their current appliance, because it's an extra investment somehow. Most people wait for their gas boiler to break, and we would like to anticipate on this as much as possible. And actually those three elements are very interesting as well for local authorities and municipalities, because that can be feeding in their own planning, their strategic planning at the local level. Like range of costs can help you calibrate the grants needed on the ground. The final energy can help you monitor the housing stock consumption, and also the remaining lifespan can help you calibrate a scrubbing premium program, for example, to help people make the decision regarding the replacement of their heating system and implementing a retrofit project. Next slide, please. Another point we think is interesting and echoes what Julien presented regarding home, getting your home future-proofed. It's the heat pump readiness indicator. It's related to the fact most of us will need our homes to be low temperature ready. So heat pump won't be a silver bullet, but they will be the bulk of the solution. So we have in mind the connection to district heating or even high temperature heat pump. But we think the information is key for homeowners to know that their heating system will need to decarbonize, mostly electrify, and also to operate flexibly. It's not the one-size-fits-all solution to roll out heat pump and not think about this insulation, because you need those heat pump to operate flexibly, meaning you need to have a proper insulation that is fit for purpose, regardless of where you live. But what is not regardless of where you live is the level of insulation, and hence this heat pump readiness indicator, to let people know how much they should invest in their insulation. Because living in a full facade house in the outskirts of Helsinki is definitely not the same thing as living in a multi-unit building in Grenada. So you need to provide guidance to people. And actually, elements are already there in most of the energy performance certificates, but sometimes not fully fulfilled by the energy assessors. I'm thinking of the U values and all the parameters linked to the insulation. Sometimes it's easier and faster to just tick the default settings. So we do need an evolution on this, and to have EPCs provided at a better and more trustworthy level. Also, I wanted to raise the question of harmonization. That doesn't mean we want a one-size-fits-all definition of the indicator all across Europe, but it's more harmonizing the methodology, how to get there. We have the example in the Netherlands, as introduced by Julien. How do we transpose this approach to other countries and mostly other climates who are cross-border? Next, please. As I mentioned, we need energy assessors to improve the quality of their work for I would say most of them. So we need to reinforce the strength of their accreditation and the accountability. We need to keep them accountable with quality checks, because it's what we aim in the end is to transform EPCs from a marketing tool, which might be seen by some households as an administrative burden and that's it, into, if we want to transform this into guidance and trustworthy project management tool, we need those EPCs to become more reliable, and that's where accountability is important. Also, it will help leverage the value for money people get, because the problem we also observe is that the least time the assessor spend on the EPC, the cheaper it becomes. So people tend to go towards what's cheaper. So if you level up what energy assessors have to do, then you don't crowd out the best practices. And we think it's interesting also for the energy assessors community. Next, please. And we wanted to also, as consumers, talk about how to make the best use of the EPC databases, because that's something that is not really appealing for now to most people. They still need to be populated in most countries. We only have a partial information. So in some countries you have geographical information system, it's to the top and you can see what's going on in your neighborhood. In most countries this is not true. Even if you have EPC databases, it's not really appealing to use them. They are not enough. You need to engage stakeholders with information. You need to make those databases appealing and have an extra layer of interaction and interface, intermediation with the stakeholders. So here, that's where we think that dynamic energy building benchmarks can be useful. They would be for multi-units and be based on mandatory disclosure of the annual energy consumptions and of the EPC rating. Annual energy consumptions, that's what makes them dynamic. And then the interest here is that at the scale of one building, you can compare your on-building theoretical consumption with what's the actual consumption from over several years once the tool is operational for a few years. And then you can compare your building with similar buildings. Anonymized doesn't mean it's all blurry. You can have a similar building based on the architectural type, the date of construction, and then you can just observe that once you have an energy retrofit, the energy consumptions goes down. So you make it clear for all stakeholders. And if implemented by municipalities, it also helps them with their planning, with the understanding of the housing stock and its dynamics. And also it can be very useful, but happy to develop then after, to introduce the minimum energy performance standards. Because that's something that's gonna require quite a lot of communication ahead and explanation, and to be plugged in a situation where you know where you stand regarding your housing stock. And I will finish here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guillaume. Very interesting presentation as well, especially from the consumer's perspective. Again, we have time for 1 or 2 questions before we move on. Any questions from here, Luxembourg, looking around? No questions? Any questions in the room? Then please raise your hand. Yes. No, that's a clapping. Michael was clapping. Looking around, no questions.
Actually, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I pressed maybe the wrong emoji.
No
Sorry.
problem.
Maybe a comment, not a question. Because in our project, it's referring to the I think last point of your presentation. So this dynamic energy benchmark, when you compare the theoretical with actual performance of buildings, which is actually a very useful tool for policymakers if their policies are faulty or they are successful. And there are examples of these, and we have in our project we have one partner that already do that, which is Switzerland, and this is Canton of Geneva. They have for many years collected measured energy, and they look at the performance of their building stock and compare it with what it should and what it actually does. And the problem with these annual performances is that apparently the information comes too slow to them if you get the data with annually. So they do the policy, they wait, they get the measurements with 1 year delay, let's say for the previous year, etc. It takes them 3 years to have any idea if the policy is useful or not, and the money is spent already there. So just a comment from our experience about that, not a question, but sharing.
Thank you very much. I see a question in the chat, and I'm asking Alexander, would you like to pose your question yourself? Please go ahead. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me. That's why I wrote
yes,
it.
we can hear you very well.
Okay, so the question, Guillaume's presentation, I think was very useful and provides a very broad context. And in this case, the issue of databases, I think, is very critical, because if you can't measure something, of course, you cannot manage it. So the question is, because there appear to be very different approaches from different countries. If at the EU level there has been some discussion and say a kind of verdict, even if this cannot be, let's say, imposed at the moment, in terms of what is acceptable under GDPR for the presentation.
We lost you, Alexander.
Sorry, apparently I was muted by mistake. So the question is if there is an EU-wide accepted approach, an approach, let's say, that has been discussed at least, even if at the moment it cannot be imposed, for publicizing the material, the data on EPCs and on buildings. So that then, let's say, if you want, the market can take over and say, oh, here's some very nice low-hanging fruit. Let's make a very good offer for the renovation. So, I mean, once the data is there, it's clear that there are also the opportunities. So that's it.
May I make a comment?
Yeah, it's a question for you, Guillaume. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment on Geneva regarding the too slow pace. So just to come back to that, we are absolutely supportive of building managers having to report quarterly. I mean, if it's part of that mandate, we are totally supportive if it's useful to policymakers. But well noted, I think it's an interesting feedback. And regarding data, there is a trade-off between the interest you can have. We have the consumer perspective, so we are definitely for privacy protection. That's why we were supportive of multi-units, but not necessarily single-family houses to be covered by those benchmarks, because then you get too many information. I understand it would be interesting in terms of marketing, because you can get the information, but we suggest to restrain the information to legitimate stakeholders, so that people don't get well, basically, if I may be blunt, harassed regarding energy retrofit works based on their own information, because that's what's happening. So we also need to be careful regarding to whom we open the data.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you also for your questions. We would move on to the panel discussion now, unless there are more questions. Let me just quickly look at the chat. I see no questions. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Kumar from Dublin, and I have a quick question regarding for the last presenter. So we are dealing here with Irish EPC database, and we were studying the quality of the data inside that database, and we found that most of the assessment, it relies on default values prescribed by the methodology here. So in our experience, it's not always the assessor at fault regarding the data quality. They lack the motivation, because if they don't use certain values prescribed by the method itself, they might be audited. So it's a kind of easy way out. You use the prescribed value, and then you will get away by not getting audited. So yeah, just the point for just the input for this data quality issue and regarding making assessor responsible for whatever they do.
Thanks for your comment.